The U.S. and Russia say they will continue working on a ceasefire in Syria after chairing a crisis meeting of the Syria Support Group in New York. RT's Ilya Petrenko has more from New York City.
Throughout the whole week, for several days, John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov were trying to come to a compromise to try and rescue the U.S.-Russia-Syria deal. But in the meantime, Washington has been trying to persuade Moscow and Damascus to ground its air force in Syria. At the same time, in the U.S. Senate, they went even further and raised the prospect of controlling the airspace over Syria.
What about the option of controlling the airspace so that barrel bombs cannot be dropped?
All the options.
What do you think of that option, sir?
Right now, Senator, for us to control all of the airspace in Syria would require us to go to war against Syria and Russia. That's a pretty fundamental decision that certainly I'm not going to make.
In the meantime, throughout this whole week, Russia's been under enormous pressure from the U.S. They are blaming Moscow for the collapse of the ceasefire, pointing finger on the Russian military for that deadly attack on a UN humanitarian convoy near Aleppo. Although, while they're doing that, the Americans are not providing any proof for their rhetoric.
I want to share some facts with you this morning. On Monday, 20 aid workers were killed in an outrageous, sustained, 2-hour attack directed at a fully authorized humanitarian mission near Aleppo. Those are facts.
I don't have the facts. No doubt in my mind that the Russians are responsible.
Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts.
The Russians are responsible for this strike, whether they conducted it or not, because they have taken responsibility for the conduct of the Syrians by associating themselves with the Syrian regime.
Well, at the same time, we're not hearing much about the actions of the U.S.-led coalition that are also hampering the ceasefire. We remember last weekend there was an attack, which Washington admitted, which killed dozens of Syrian troops, but somehow that isn't seen as a reason to ground coalition jets over Syria.
To talk more about this, I'm being joined now by former Pentagon official Michael Maloof. Mike, Defense Secretary Ash Carter, chairman and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunsford, told the Senate Armed Services Committee that they believe that, quote, they said, the Russians are responsible for this strike, whether they conducted it or not, because they took responsibility for the conduct of the Syrians by associating themselves with the Syrian regime. Obviously, that's in reference to the convoy, the aid convoy. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
No. Even Dunford in the testimony had to concede that he felt that the Russians did it, but he really didn't have the facts. And so, I mean, that was a further statement that he did make. He conceded that. I think my personal assessment is that it's not in the interest of the opposition fighters to have a settlement, and even though, and it's strange that, and I think that they probably were involved. Yeah. You had the United States, UN, and Russia all agree that this convoy could go in. Yeah. And none of those participants are going to be firing on this thing, and yet there's also the indication that Russia had a drone that took some video showing ISIS cars coming up against the convoy. So that needs to be looked at. Now, there's no way that the United States is able to control these so-called moderates. I don't know who gave them the title of moderates, but they're all associated with either ISIS or with al-Nusra. The problem is that they're not against ISIS. They are against the Assad government. Right. And there's nothing that the United States can do to channel that.
But now, after that statement was made, Senator Roger Wicker, a Republican from Mississippi, proposed the idea of a no-fly zone. His sentiments were quickly rebuked by John McCain and General Dunsford because they said it would require the U.S. to officially go to war with Syria. Are there any other ways around that? Or given your experience at the Pentagon, is that sort of language posturing? Is it setting a stage, possibly, for war?
Well, I think a no-fly zone was ruled out some time ago, particularly for Syria, given the various factions. It's unlike Libya. Libya was a different story. You could institute one over there, and they successfully did. Syria is a totally different bag of worms, and it's going to be almost impossible to do that. If you're going to have a no-fly, Dunford was correct in saying it will be tantamount to a declaration of war with Russia and with Syria, and it will also allow, if theoretically they could institute one, it would allow the so-called moderates to regain traction, and there would be no way to stop them from attacks, and it would put the Assad government at a disadvantage because it'd be unable to protect itself.
But also General Dunsford expressed plans of arming the Kurds the other day in front of Senate. This comes with obviously pushback from the Turks, who are official U.S. allies. What's this going to do to the relationship if Dunsford has his way with arming the Kurds? Well, they've already begun, frankly, arming the Kurds. It's going to set further tensions between Ankara and Washington, but there are overarching strategic interests that are going to keep them still talking to one another and working with one another. I think at some point, however, the Kurds are not going to be wanting to, the U.S. is probably going to stop providing assistance to the Kurds and yield to the larger strategic interests of Turkey, Russia. Mike, we got to leave that right there. I know there's a lot more to talk about, but we'll have you back on as always. This is ongoing. That was former senior security policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Michael Maloof.